On August 22nd, 1862, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to a newspaper editor named Horace Greeley. The letter was published. It was read across the country. It still exists today in the Library of Congress, and you can read every word of it online in about 4 minutes. Here's what it says. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Read that again, slowly. The man we call the Great Emancipator wrote in a public letter that his highest goal was saving the Union, not freeing a single slave. He wrote this in his own words. He published it. He stood behind it. 90 days later, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. I want you to hold those two dates, August 22nd, 1862, January 1st, 1863, 90 days. Because everything that follows depends on understanding not just what changed in those 90 days, but what was happening in those 90 days that most history classes compress into a single paragraph or skip entirely. This is not a story about a villain. It is not a story about a saint. It is a story about a man in an impossible position who found the only exit available to him. And that exit happened to change the country forever. I want to show you how he got there. Because the road to the Emancipation Proclamation does not begin with moral clarity. It begins with a military disaster, a British threat that almost nobody talks about today, a political crisis inside his own party, and a document sitting in a desk drawer for 7 weeks while Lincoln publicly said the opposite of what that document contained. The story we were taught was cleaner. The story that actually happened is more interesting. What he said. When he took office, Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. 7 states had already seceded. Jefferson Davis had already been named President of the Confederate States of America. Fort Sumter would fall in 6 weeks. Lincoln stood at the Capitol and made a promise. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. This was not a political compromise designed to appease the South. The South was already leaving. This was Lincoln's sincere constitutional reading of a document that explicitly protected slavery in the states where it existed. The Fifth Amendment guaranteed that no person could be deprived of property without due process of law. Enslaved people were legally property under the laws of the states that held them. Lincoln was a lawyer. He understood what the Constitution said. He was also a politician who had won the presidency with 39% of the popular vote in a 4-way race, carrying no southern states, winning no electoral votes from any state where slavery was legal. His mandate was regional. His power was fragile. The border states, Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri, still held slavery and still remained in the Union. And Lincoln understood that pushing them towards secession would be catastrophic. Maryland alone surrounded Washington on 3 sides. So Lincoln, in March of 1861, was a president who believed he had no constitutional authority to touch slavery, who had explicitly promised not to touch it, who needed to keep 4 slave states inside a union he was trying to preserve, and whose primary stated goal was not the abolition of an institution, but the maintenance of a constitutional structure. That is the man who, 16 months later, he signed a document called the Emancipation Proclamation. The distance between those two positions is the story. The first year of the war. The Civil War did not begin as a war about slavery. That is not a controversial statement. It is what Lincoln said, what most Northern politicians said, and what the recruits who filled the Union armies in the summer of 1861 believed when they enlisted. They were fighting for the Union, for the Constitution, for the idea that a democratic government could not simply be dissolved by the minority that lost an election. The Confederacy, for its part, was entirely explicit about what it was fighting for. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens gave a speech in March of 1861 that historians now call the cornerstone speech. He said clearly and at length that the Confederacy's foundations were built on the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. He said this proudly. He considered it a scientific fact and a moral improvement on the founders' ambiguous language about equality. But the Union armies were not fighting against that. They were fighting for a legal and constitutional principle. For the first year, the war went badly. The first Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861 was supposed to be a quick Union victory that would end the rebellion in weeks. Union troops fled back to Washington in disorder. Civilian spectators who had driven out from the Capitol to watch the battle had to turn their carriages around and run. General George McClellan, appointed to command the Army of the Potomac, spent the next 9 months drilling and training and refusing to fight. He was an excellent organizer and a terrible general. He consistently overestimated Confederate strength. He consistently found reasons to delay. When Lincoln finally pressured him into the Peninsula Campaign in the spring of 1862, it ended in the 7 days battles near Richmond, a series of engagements in which McClellan was tactically outmaneuvered by Robert E. Lee and retreated to the James River, abandoning the campaign entirely. By the summer of 1862, the Union had been at war for 15 months and had almost nothing to show for it. Public enthusiasm for the war was fading in the North. Volunteer enlistments had slowed to a trickle. The draft, which Lincoln would not dare impose until March of 1863, was politically unthinkable. The Army needed men. The war needed momentum. Lincoln needed something that he did not yet have. What he had was a desk drawer, and in that desk drawer, since sometime in June of 1862, was a document, the proposal he made before the proclamation. Before we get to that document, we need to understand one more thing Lincoln tried first, because it tells you everything about where his thinking was in the spring of 1862. In March of 1862, Lincoln sent a special message to Congress. He proposed that the federal government offer financial compensation to any slave state that voluntarily adopted gradual emancipation. The federal government would pay the slaveholders. The states would phase out slavery over time. The enslaved people would eventually be free, and then he proposed they would be encouraged to immigrate to Liberia, to Central America, somewhere that was not the United States. Lincoln called this colonization, and he believed in it for longer than his admirers usually acknowledge. In August of 1862, the same month he wrote the letter to Greeley, He met with a delegation of free black leaders at the White House and urged them to support voluntary immigration. He told them that the presence of black people in America was the cause of the war, and that both races would be better served by separation. Frederick Douglass, who would later call Lincoln the first great man he had ever met, read the transcript of that meeting and was furious. He wrote that Lincoln's position was contemptible, that it blamed the victim, that it asked the people who had been enslaved for generations to solve the problem by leaving the country they had built. Lincoln's compensated emancipation proposal went nowhere. Congress was not interested. The border states were not interested. The cost estimates were astronomical, and the war was getting worse. So Lincoln turned to the document in the drawer. What was there before the Carpenters' Company of Philadelphia was founded in 1724, and they built things that are still standing. I keep thinking about that when I think about Lincoln, because the guild system and Lincoln's America were products of the same underlying question. What do you do when the official system fails to deliver what it promised? The guild system's answer was community accountability. Lincoln's answer is when the official systems of compromise and compensation and voluntary action all failed, was something harder and stranger and more permanent. But I am getting ahead of the story. Let me take you back to July 22nd, 1862. A Tuesday, Lincoln calls his cabinet to a meeting that none of them are expecting. The document in the drawer Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, kept a diary. Secretary of the Treasury Salmon Chase kept a diary. Both of them recorded what happened in the cabinet meeting of July 22, 1862, and their accounts agree on the essential facts. Lincoln told them he had made a decision. He was not asking for their opinion on whether to make the decision. He had made it. He was informing them, and he was asking for their advice on timing and language. Then he read them the first draft of what would become the Emancipation Proclamation. The cabinet was stunned, not because they opposed emancipation as a principle, though some of them had reservations. They were stunned because Lincoln had said nothing about this. He had given no indication that his thinking had shifted. The man who had written the compensated emancipation proposal 4 months earlier, the man who had publicly insisted that his goal was saving the Union, had produced a document that declared enslaved people in Confederate states to be free as of January 1st, 1863. Montgomery Blair, the Postmaster General, opposed it. He thought it would cost the Republicans the fall elections. Chase actually supported emancipation, but thought the method was wrong, that Lincoln should let individual commanders do it rather than a sweeping executive order. Others had concerns about the legal authority. And then Secretary of State William Seward spoke. He said he agreed with the principle. He was not opposed. But he had one concern about timing. The Union had just suffered a major military defeat. The Peninsula Campaign had failed. McClellan was sitting on the James River, having accomplished nothing. If Lincoln issued this proclamation now in the immediate aftermath of military failure, it would look like what it might actually be. Desperation. The last measure of a government that had run out of options. Foreign governments would read it as weakness. The European powers who were watching the war closely, and one of them was watching very closely, would see it as the act of a losing side trying to change the subject. Wait, Seward said, wait for a victory. Issue it from a position of strength, not weakness. Lincoln put the document back in the drawer, and 4 weeks later, he wrote the letter to Greeley. The letter and the drawer. I want you to sit with the sequence for a moment, because this is the detail that changes everything. On July 22nd, 1862, Lincoln shows his cabinet a document that says, enslaved people in Confederate states will be free as of January 1st, 1863. This document exists. He has written it. He believes it is the right action. He is waiting only for the right moment to announce it. On August 22nd, 1862, Lincoln publishes a letter in a major newspaper saying that his highest goal is saving the Union, not freeing any slave. Both of these things happened. Both are documented. Both are verifiable. And Lincoln was not lying in the letter to Greeley. He was being precise in a way that was designed to be misleading. His highest goal, in the context of his constitutional authority and his understanding of the war, was indeed saving the Union. The Emancipation Proclamation was a tool for saving the Union. He was not issuing it as a moral statement. He was issuing it as a military and diplomatic strategy. But he could not say that publicly. Just because if he revealed that he was about to free enslaved people in Confederate states, the announcement would come before the military victory he needed in exactly the context Seward had warned against. So he told the truth about his goal, which was saving the Union, while concealing the method he had chosen, which was emancipation. And he waited 30 days, 60 days. The document sat in the drawer while Lincoln read dispatches from the front, watched enlistment numbers fall, and waited for something he could call a victory. The three crises. While Lincoln waited, three separate crises were building simultaneously. History tends to teach them separately. They were not separate. They were pressing on Lincoln from three directions at the same time, and understanding all three of them together is the only way to understand why the proclamation took the shape it did. The first crisis was military, and you already know most of it. The war was going badly. The Army needed men. Free black men in the North were eager to enlist and were being turned away. The Union needed them. And 3.5 million enslaved people in the South represented a labor force, a supply chain, a fortification workforce, and a potential military force that was currently serving the Confederacy. A proclamation that invited them to abandon their enslaved condition and come to the Union side was not just a moral gesture. It was a strategic disruption of Confederate logistics. The second crisis was political, and it came from inside Lincoln's own party. The radical Republicans, men like Thaddeus Stevens in the House and Charles Sumner in the Senate, had been pushing for emancipation since the war began. They controlled key congressional committees. Without their cooperation, Lincoln could not pass the financial legislation he needed to fund the war. Without their support, his own party would fracture. Oh, they were losing patience with Lincoln's caution, and some of them were beginning to talk openly about replacing him. The third crisis is the one that almost nobody teaches in American schools, and it is the one that, in the judgment of most serious historians of the period, may have been the most urgent of all. Great Britain was on the verge of recognizing the Confederacy, the British crisis. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the economics of 1862 Britain, The British textile industry was the most important manufacturing sector in the world's most powerful economy. Lancashire and Yorkshire mills employed hundreds of thousands of workers and produced cloth that was exported everywhere. And those mills ran on cotton, Southern American cotton. About 80% of all the cotton that fed British industry came from the Confederate States. When the Union blockade of southern ports began in 1861, that cotton stopped flowing. By the summer of 1862, hundreds of thousands of British textile workers were unemployed. Towns were facing starvation. The crisis had a name, the Lancashire Cotton Famine, and it was generating enormous political pressure on the British government to do something. The something that was being proposed was diplomatic recognition of the Confederacy. If Britain recognized the Confederacy as an independent nation, everything changed. The Union blockade would become an act of war against the ships of a neutral power, while the Confederacy would gain access to British loans, British weapons, and British diplomatic support. The calculation of the war shifted entirely. Prime Minister Lord Palmerston was skeptical of intervention, but not opposed to it. Foreign Secretary Lord Russell was more favorable. In the cabinet debates of the summer of 1862, recognition was not a fringe position. It was a serious policy option being seriously debated. And then William Gladstone, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and one of the most influential figures in British politics, gave a speech in Newcastle in October of 1862, in which he said publicly that Jefferson Davis had made a nation. Gladstone was widely understood to be speaking with some degree of official sanction. The speech created a diplomatic crisis. American diplomats in London sent urgent dispatches to Washington. Charles Francis Adams, the American minister to Britain and the grandson of John Adams, reported that recognition was closer than it had ever been. Lincoln understood this with complete clarity. A war that the British government could frame as a conflict over tariffs and constitutional interpretation, a dispute between two white governments over the question of federal versus state authority, could potentially be supported or at least remain neutral on with some degree of British comfort. The British establishment had its own complicated relationship with constitutional arguments about secession, but a war explicitly framed as a war against slavery was a different thing entirely. Britain had abolished slavery in 1833. The abolitionist movement in Britain had been one of the great moral campaigns of the 19th century. William Wilberforce had spent his career fighting for abolition. The British public, whatever their economic interest in Southern cotton, but had a deep emotional investment in the idea that their country stood against slavery. If Lincoln transformed the American Civil War from a constitutional conflict into a war for human freedom, the British government could not stand with the slaveholders without a domestic political revolt. The moral case for intervention on behalf of the Confederacy would collapse. This was not a side effect of the Emancipation Proclamation. It was one of its primary purposes. Seward understood it. Lincoln understood it. The document in the desk drawer was addressed not only to the enslaved people of the Confederate States, it was addressed to the British Parliament. The Wait and the Victory. By September of 1862, Lincoln had been waiting for almost 2 months. The document was ready. Seward's advice had been to wait for a victory. There had been no victory. Then came the Battle of Antietam. September 17th, 1862, Sharpsburg, Maryland. The bloodiest single day in American military history. 23,000 casualties in one day. The Union Army, under George McClellan, fought the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia under Robert E. Lee to a tactical standstill. Lee had invaded the North for the first time. He was stopped. He retreated back across the Potomac into Virginia. McClellan called it a victory. Military historians call it, roughly, a draw. Confederate forces had failed to hold the field, which is the standard definition of a tactical defeat, but McClellan failed to pursue Lee's retreating army despite having fresh troops available, which is why Lincoln eventually fired him. Lincoln called it enough. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam, Lincoln gathered his cabinet again. He told them the time had come. He told them, in words recorded by Salmon Chase, that he had made a vow to God that if the Confederate Army was driven out of Maryland, he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. He was fulfilling his vow. The preliminary Emancipation Proclamation was issued that same day. It announced that on January 1st, 1863, all persons held as slaves in states still in rebellion against the United States would be declared free. 100 days passed between the preliminary proclamation and the final one. During those 100 days, Lincoln watched to see whether any Confederate state would return to the Union, which would exempt it from the proclamation. None did. On January 1st, 1863, he signed the final Emancipation Proclamation, what it said and what it did not say. Most Americans have never read the Emancipation Proclamation. It is one of the most famous documents in American history, and one of the least read. If you have not read it, I want to describe it to you carefully, because the details matter. The proclamation was issued as a war powers order under Lincoln's authority as Commander-in-Chief. This is important. It was not legislation. Congress did not vote on it. It was an executive military order, which meant it derived its legal authority entirely from Lincoln's wartime powers, which also meant it could potentially be reversed by a future president claiming those powers had expired. The proclamation declared free all persons held as slaves within the rebellious states. It listed them by name: Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, except the parishes of St. Bernard, Plaquemines, Jefferson, St. John, St. Charles, St. James, Ascension, Assumption, Terrebonne, Lafourche, St. Mary, St. Martin, and Orleans, including the city of New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, except the 48 counties designated as West Virginia, and also except the counties of Berkeley, Accomack, Northampton, Elizabeth City, York, Princess Anne, and Norfolk, including the cities of Norfolk and Portsmouth. Read that again, slowly. The proclamation exempted the parts of Louisiana already under Union control. It exempted the counties of Virginia that would become West Virginia. It exempted specific counties in Virginia where Union forces were present. And it said nothing at all about Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, or Missouri, the 4 slave states that had remained in the Union. Slavery continued legally in all 4 of them. The document that freed the slaves freed them only where Lincoln had no legal authority or military power to enforce the freedom. Where he had authority and power, he made exceptions. I am not telling you what to conclude from this. I am telling you what the document says. You can read it yourself in about 10 minutes. The interpretation that most historians offer, and I think it is correct, is that this was the only legally and politically viable form the proclamation could take. As a war powers order, it applied to enemy territory. The border states were not enemy territory. Applying it, there would have been constitutionally dubious, politically catastrophic, and potentially enough to push one or more of the border states into the Confederacy. But the gap between the proclamation's rhetoric and its legal reach is real, and understanding it changes what you understand about what Lincoln was doing and why. The response that changed everything. On October 7, 1862, 2 weeks after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, a British cabinet meeting convened to discuss recognition of the Confederacy. Prime Minister Palmerston had written to Foreign Secretary Russell in September suggesting a joint Anglo-French mediation proposal. Russell had been favorable. The meeting was called to decide. The preliminary proclamation had been issued 15 days earlier. At the meeting, Secretary of State for War George Lewis argued against intervention. The arguments that had seemed compelling in August looked different now. The proclamation had reframed the war. If Britain intervened on behalf of the Confederacy, it was intervening against emancipation. The British public, which had mobilized for abolition for 3 decades, would not accept that. The meeting ended without a decision to intervene. The discussions continued through the fall, but the momentum for recognition never recovered. By the end of 1862, the window had closed. The Emancipation Proclamation, issued 5 days after Antietam, ended the British threat to recognize the Confederacy. This is not speculation, it is the documented historical consensus based on British parliamentary records, cabinet minutes, and diplomatic correspondence that have been studied by historians for over a century. Lincoln did not issue the proclamation to affect British policy. He issued it because 3 crises had converged into a single moment where it was the only available strategic response to all of them simultaneously. But it affected British policy profoundly. Whether he anticipated that effect fully, whether Seward anticipated it and communicated it to Lincoln, is something historians continue to argue about. What is not arguable is the sequence. Preliminary proclamation on September 22nd. British cabinet meeting on October 7th. Decision not to intervene. The timing is what it is. What happened in the South. While British politicians reconsidered their options, something else was happening across the Confederate States. The enslaved people of the South understood what the proclamation meant, even in places where its legal reach was limited or non-existent. Word spread through networks of communication that slaveholders had spent decades trying to suppress. People who could read shared what they had read. People who could not read listened. The news moved, and people began to leave. The scale of what historians call the contrabands, enslaved people who escaped to Union lines and claimed the protection of the proclamation, accelerated dramatically after January 1st, 1863. By the end of the war, approximately 500,000 enslaved people had escaped to Union lines. They came as laborers, as scouts, as guides who knew the terrain, and eventually as soldiers. In April of 1863, Lincoln authorized the enlistment of black soldiers into the Union Army. By the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black men had served in the United States colored troops. They made up roughly 10% of the Union Army. General Ulysses Grant wrote after the war that the black soldiers were among the bravest fighters he commanded. He wrote that without black enlistment, it was doubtful whether the war could have been won. Lincoln had written in August of 1862 that he would free the slaves if it helped save the Union. He had been more honest than the people who sanitized his legacy gave him credit for. Freeing the slaves did help save the Union, not as a side effect, as a direct military contribution that changed the arithmetic of the war. The people who were actually freed. I want to stop here and say something that gets lost in the political and diplomatic analysis. The Emancipation Proclamation, for all its legal limitations, for all its geographic exceptions, for all the ways it was an instrument of military policy rather than a pure moral statement, was experienced by real people as freedom. Not theoretical freedom, not eventual freedom. Freedom on January 1st, 1863, in the parts of the country where Union forces arrived to enforce it. And in the months and years that followed, freedom spreading as those forces moved. Consider what that meant concretely. A family that had been enslaved for generations, children who had been born into a legal condition that said they were property, a mother who had watched children sold away from her, a father who had no legal standing to protect his family from anything. On January 1st, 1863, the legal framework that defined them as property was publicly and formally repudiated by the government of the United States, regardless of what Confederate authorities said, regardless of what happened in the border states, regardless of all the political calculations that had produced the document. Frederick Douglass, who had criticized the compensated emancipation proposal, who had been furious about the colonization meeting, who had called Lincoln's early positions contemptible, ought to read the proclamation and understood something. He wrote that the 1st of January, 1863, was the most memorable day in American annals. He wrote that the proclamation changed the character of the war. He wrote that from that day forward, the war was not merely a war for the preservation of the Union, but a war for the liberation of the oppressed. Douglass would visit Lincoln at the White House in August of 1863. He would visit again in 1864. After Lincoln's second inauguration, at the reception at the White House, Lincoln saw Douglass in the crowd and called out to him. He asked Douglass what he thought of the inaugural address. He said he wanted the opinion of a man whose judgment he valued. Douglass wrote later that Lincoln was the first great man he had ever met who did not make him feel that he was black. The letter he wrote to himself in April of 1864, 15 months after the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln wrote a letter to a Kentucky newspaper editor named Albert Hodges. It was not a famous letter. It did not become famous until historians began studying it a generation later. In it, Lincoln wrote something that no monument has ever quoted because it does not fit the monument version of the story. He wrote, "I claim not to have controlled events, but confess plainly that events have controlled me." Read that carefully. This is not false modesty. Oh, this is not a rhetorical device. This is a private letter to a man in Kentucky, not a public address designed to shape his legacy. Lincoln is telling Hodges in direct and unadorned language that the man who issued the Emancipation Proclamation did not issue it because he had always known it was right and had been waiting for the moment to act on his convictions. He issued it because the circumstances of 1862 had eliminated every other option and left him with one door. The war was going badly. The army needed men. Britain was moving toward recognition. The radical Republicans were threatening to fracture his party. Compensated emancipation had gone nowhere. Colonization was a fantasy. The political calculus had shifted to a point where emancipation, which Lincoln had been constitutionally and politically reluctant to pursue, had become not just acceptable, but necessary. And Lincoln looked at that door and walked through it. Events have controlled me. He had walked into the presidency in 1861 promising not to touch slavery. He had walked out of it before a bullet took him as the man who had ended it permanently. And he was honest enough in a private letter to acknowledge that the distance between those two positions was traveled not by moral evolution alone, but by the pressure of events that left him with no other place to go. That honesty is worth more than any monument. The thing that made it permanent. There is one more piece of this story that almost never gets the attention it deserves. The Emancipation Proclamation was a war powers order. Lincoln issued it under his authority as commander-in-chief during wartime. That authority derived from the existence of the war. If the war ended, the authority ended. A future president could argue, and some people worried that a future president would argue, that the proclamation had no force in peacetime. Lincoln understood this. He had understood it since the beginning. The proclamation was a military instrument. What he needed and what he spent most of 1864 fighting to achieve was a constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery throughout the United States permanently, constitutionally, in language that no executive order could override and no future president could repeal, was introduced in the Senate in April of 1864 and passed in June. But it still needed the House. The House voted in June of 1864, and the amendment failed. It did not get the two-thirds majority required. Lincoln made it the central commitment of his second term. After his re-election in November of 1864, he personally lobbied wavering House members. His administration offered federal patronage positions, government contracts, promises of appointments in exchange for votes. Some of what Lincoln and his allies did to get the 13th Amendment through the House would be called corruption today. Lincoln did not care. He needed the amendment. He needed the votes. He used the tools he had. On January 31st, 1865, the House of Representatives passed the 13th Amendment by a vote of 119 to 56. The gallery erupted. Spectators wept. Guns were fired in celebration outside. Dear Lincoln signed the joint resolution of Congress submitting the amendment to the states for ratification. Though his signature was technically not required, he wanted his name on it. The amendment was ratified on December 6, 1865, 8 months after Lincoln was dead. The last speech and the man in the audience. On April 11, 1865, 4 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox, Lincoln gave a speech from the window of the White House to a crowd gathered on the lawn below. It was the last public speech of his life. He talked about Reconstruction, about how to bring the Southern states back, about his plan for Louisiana, which had already set up a free state government that had rejected slavery. He talked cautiously about extending voting rights to some black men, specifically those who were very intelligent and those who had served in the Union Army. Standing in the crowd was an actor named John Wilkes Booth. Booth had come to Washington intending to kidnap Lincoln, not kill him. The war had ended. The kidnapping plot was dead. He was there that evening on impulse, drawn by the crowd. He listened to Lincoln talk about black voting rights. He turned to a companion and said, "That is the last speech he will ever make." 3 days later, on April 14th, 1865, Lincoln sat in a box at Ford's Theater watching a play called Our American Cousin. At 10:15 in the evening, had Booth walked into the box and shot him once in the back of the head. Lincoln died the following morning at 7:22 a.m., April 15th, 1865. He never knew that the 13th Amendment would be ratified. He never knew that the country he had spent 4 years fighting to preserve would add to its Constitution the words, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, shall exist within the United States." He had written in June of 1862, in the privacy of his own thoughts before showing the draft to his cabinet, a document that began the process. He had signed it in January of 1863 under the pressure of military failure, diplomatic crisis, and political necessity. He had fought for 2 years to make it permanent through a constitutional amendment that survived his assassination by 8 months. The man who had written in August of 1862 that he would free no slave if it served his goal had, by the time a bullet found him, freed them all, what the sequence tells you. I want to go back to the beginning because the sequence is the point. March 4th, 1861. Lincoln in his inaugural address. No purpose to interfere with slavery where it exists. March 6th, 1862. Lincoln proposes compensated emancipation with colonization. July 22nd, 1862. Lincoln shows the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation to his cabinet. August 22nd, 1862. Lincoln writes the letter to Greeley. Saving the Union is my highest goal. September 17th, 1862. Battle of Antietam. September 22nd, 1862. Preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. October 7th, 1862. British Cabinet meets and decides against intervention. January 1st, 1863. Final Emancipation Proclamation. April 1864. Lincoln writes to Hodges, "Events have controlled me." January 31st, 1865. House passes the 13th Amendment. April 11th, 1865. Lincoln's last speech, Booth in the audience. April 14th, 1865. Ford's Theater. December 6th, 1865. The 13th Amendment ratified. Each of those dates connects to the next. Each decision was shaped by what had happened before it and what was threatening to happen next. Lincoln did not sit in 1861 with a plan to reach December 1865. He moved from position to position under the pressure of events that he did not control and often did not anticipate. The man who ended American slavery did not begin his presidency intending to end American slavery. He began it intending to preserve a constitutional union that, at that moment, included slavery as a legal institution in 15 states. Between that intention and that outcome is a story about what happens when a person of genuine, if complicated, principle is placed inside a catastrophe and forced to find the only door that leads out. Some doors turn out to matter more than you knew when you walked through them. The questions that do not go away. The buildings that the Carpenters Company built in Philadelphia are still standing after 2.5 centuries because the system that produced them made quality the only rational professional choice. The craftsmen who built them could not afford for their work to fail. Their names were permanently attached to what they made. Lincoln's name is permanently attached to what he made. The 13th Amendment, the end of legal slavery in the United States. The beginning, however incomplete and troubled, of a different kind of country. But what was his name attached to in August of 1862 when he wrote that letter to Greeley? What was he making then? He was making a calculation. He was preserving his options. He was waiting for a moment that Seward had told him needed to come first. He was doing what politicians do. He was managing what was possible in the direction of what he believed was right, all without ever being certain that what was right was achievable, and without ever being honest about what he was doing while he was doing it. And then events controlled him into the only decision that was left. I have been thinking about what Douglas wrote after that White House meeting, that Lincoln was the first great man who did not make him feel that he was black, not the first who respected him, not the first who treated him with dignity in the abstract, the first who, in a room or in person, talked to him as if the category of his race was not the primary fact about him. What kind of man was Lincoln exactly in that room with Douglas? The man who had proposed colonization, the man who had written the letter to Greeley, the man who had walked through the only door that was left and found himself, almost by accident, on the right side of history? Or was the right side always where he was heading, moving toward it by the only route the circumstances allowed, taking longer than it should have taken, using tools that were sometimes ugly, arriving finally at a destination that no monument fully captures? I do not know. The letter to Hodges keeps coming back to me. Events have controlled me. He got there. Whatever combination of moral conviction, political calculation, military necessity, diplomatic maneuvering, and pure historical pressure pushed him there. He got there. And the amendment he fought for, the one that made it permanent, the one that survived his assassination, was ratified 8 months after the bullet found him. 2 dates, August 22, 1862, January 1st, 1863, 90 days. And the road between them was traveled not by a saint who always knew the answer, but by a man who was driven to the answer by 3 simultaneous crises that left him only one door. I have only questions I cannot fully answer, whether Lincoln's moral evolution was genuine or tactical, whether the colonization proposal was sincere or political cover, whether Booth's bullet robbed the country of a reconstruction that might have gone differently, whether the events that controlled Lincoln were truly uncontrollable, or whether a different man in the same office might have found the door sooner. But the questions do not go away, and once you start asking them, you will find they never do. The desk in the Library of Congress is not a writing desk. It is a letter, dated August 22nd, 1862, signed with the name of a man who was, at that moment, 7 weeks away from the moment that would define his name forever. He did not know that yet. He was just waiting for a victory. 23 to 21, 2 votes, 90 days. The world your great-great-grandparents were born into was one in which 4 million people were legally property. The world they died in was not. The distance between those two worlds was traveled by events that controlled a man who, in the end, let them.